Hello. On January the 5th, 1066, Edward the Confessor, King of England, died after ruling England since 1045. He was buried in the newly constructed Westminster Abbey. This death created a crisis of succession, two epic battles, and had a huge influence on the English language. This influence is still with us today. Before we go on, could you please give the YouTube algorithm a nudge by clicking on like and subscribe if you haven't done so already? And why not share it with your friends? Anyway, back to the story. Edward died without an heir, so who would be the next king? According to Duke William of Normandy, Edward had promised the throne to him. The old king had surrounded himself with Norman advisers, much to the anger of the English nobility. Perhaps for this reason, on the following day, they elected the Queen's brother, Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, to be king. He was crowned on January the 6th, only the day after the death of the old king, and immediately after Edward's burial. The reason for the haste was that all the formalities would be over before William, Duke of Normandy, had even received the news of the old king's death. Duke William of Normandy took a very dim view of this indeed. He claimed that Harold Godwinson had sworn allegiance to him to be king when he was visiting Normandy some time before. Duke William was not the type of person to take this sort of thing lying down. He was known as William the Bastard. However, this was more a reference to the marital status of his parents than to a comment on his character. In any case, he planned to take the English throne by force. Before moving on with the story, who was William, Duke of Normandy, and who were the Normans? And where did they come from? Although Normandy is in modern-day France, the origin of the name is the land of the Northmen, Normans, and these Northmen were in effect Vikings. The kingdom of West Francia, which is now France, had also suffered from Viking raids in the past, and in 911, their king, Charles III, had made a treaty with a Viking leader called Rollo. The treaty gave the Vikings possession of what is now Normandy in exchange for defense against other Vikings. This is an old trick, but very often doesn't work because in effect all you do is achieve a breakaway state in the northern coast, which is exactly what happened. Effectively, although officially William, Duke of Normandy owed his loyalty to the King of France, in reality his duchy was run as an independent kingdom. The fact that Charles III of West Francia was known as Charles the Simple speaks volumes. The Normans came from Scandinavia and, like all of the Viking population, spoke a Germanic language. They changed their language to French, or at least to Norman French, when they moved to Normandy. This is not as rare as you might think. One only has to think about the aristocracy of Russia at the time of the Tsars, many of whom spoke far better French than Russian. However, the fact that the Normans spoke French is relevant to our story. Duke William prepared his army and a fleet to invade England. This plan was risky because King Harold was expecting him, and resisted amphibious landings are very difficult. This is why they are so rare in history. Luckily for William, King Harold had an additional problem. In the late summer of 1066, there was an invasion in the north of England by the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, accompanied by Tostig, King Harold Godwinson's younger brother, who also had royal ambitions. There are far too many Harolds in this story. King Harold of England rushed his army north and, in a surprise attack at Stamford Bridge, in what is now Yorkshire, defeated the King of Norway and Tostig, both of whom were killed. While the King of England was occupied in the north, Duke William struck and landed his army in southeast England. He started to raid the countryside around his landing point to force Harold to hurry back from the north. After defeating the Norwegian-led invasion in Yorkshire on the 25th of September, and on hearing the news of Duke William's invasion, Harold's force marched south from Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire to the south coast of England and confronted William on the 14th of October. This is a distance of 275 miles or 439 kilometres, and when the two armies met on the 14th of October at Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon English army was already exhausted, while the Norman army was well rested. However, the battle was not as easy for the Normans as you might have imagined, and it raged all day. In the end, the English army was defeated and King Harold died on the battlefield. To cut a long story short, William made his way to London and was crowned as King of England on Christmas Day 1066 in Westminster Abbey. It is often thought that the Norman Conquest ended at this point. Nothing could be further from the truth. There were frequent rebellions against the Normans, especially in the north of England, and as a consequence of this and of William's need to reward his followers, the majority of the Saxon English nobility were driven into exile or killed, and their place was taken by predominantly Norman aristocracy. One of the consequences of this was that England effectively was divided between the French-speaking Norman ruling class and the English-speaking general population, which consisted mainly of peasants, craftsmen, but also of merchants. For the next 300 years, the language of government, the law, and high society was Norman French, while the general population continued to speak English. Obviously, as in most of medieval Europe, official documents were written in Latin, but official business, when it was spoken, was conducted in French in England. If we look at a lot of the legal terminology, but also the government terminology, we can see that French vocabulary predominates. Take the name for Parliament, for example. It is obviously a French word. The predecessor of the Parliament was known as the Thing. The effects of all this can be seen today. If we look at these words and expressions, you can see that the ones on the left are the Anglo-Saxon Norse, while the ones on the right are French Latin equivalents. The French Latin ones are used in more formal and official contexts, as French and Latin were used at the time. If you use the French Latin expressions with friends and family, they can come across as cold and unfriendly. The last example here is not of two equivalents except in the grammatical sense. They are both possessive forms. The decision whether to use one form or the other is something that causes confusion among a lot of learners of English. It's really about style. It can't be said that the dog of my sister would be absolutely incorrect, but it does sound very strange. It gives me the sensation that the dog has an official position and probably its own office. Here we can see some modern German and French words with their English equivalents. Some interesting things can be illustrated here. One is that the words of French origins can be connected to official bodies, official people, judges, parliament, and so on, while the German vocabulary is connected with much more familiar things that are closer to home. There is also something interesting here about the more expensive foods that have French vocabulary, whereas the animals that produce the food are Germanic. The theory is this: the Anglo-Saxon speaking peasants raised the animals, but they could certainly not afford to eat the meat. The meat was eaten by their French-speaking masters and mistresses. Many people believed that the English was doomed, and its destiny was to break up into a variety of mutually incomprehensible dialects, and this nearly happened. However, 300 years after the Norman Conquest, English came out of the wilderness. English survived the threat to its existence. Although the Norman Conquest had relegated English to a predominantly oral language, it survived and after 300 years returned to centre stage. However, the English that returned to centre stage was very different from the old pre-Norman Conquest English. That's a story of the next episode. English bounces back. Bye for now.